After the Petr Yan Davison Figueiredo main event, it seems like the bantamweight division in the UFC is just completely wide open at this point. So I wanted to make a video and kind of play matchmaker here for the 135-pound division. There is currently not a single fighter in the top 15 who is booked. So we're going to go through, matchmake for all these fighters. Would love to hear your thoughts on these fights. If you have some different opinions, would love to hear them down below. But I feel like we have to start off here with the champion, Merab, and his next title fight. So I think at this point, there's a pretty clear top two in terms of the contenders. We have Umar Nurmagomedov and Petr Yan. I think both guys, have a case to fight for the belt. For Petr Yan, I do think he has the better resume. In my opinion, wins over Davison Figueiredo and Song Yadong are more impressive than Umar's one singular win over Corey Sandhagen. But I think Umar has the advantage of being the fresh matchup, where we've already seen, Merab take on Petr Yan. It was not a super competitive fight. Merab pretty much dominated all 5 rounds. Yan just could not deal with the wrestling, the grappling of Merab Dvalishvili. So with Umar, you do kind of have that fresh matchup, which maybe is intriguing to the UFC and potentially to the fans. And we can, debate who's more deserving, who, should get that rightful title shot. I honestly think it's just going to be Merab's timing and Ramadan that are probably going to play the biggest factors here. It seems like Merab wants to return at UFC 313 in Vegas, which is on March 8th. Now, I think a lot of people out there are going to say that Merab is running from Umar. He doesn't want the fight. That's why he's trying to, push this matchup back. And it does seem like he'd prefer to fight Petr Yan. That's who he's calling out. I don't think that necessarily means he is afraid of an Umar Nurmagomedov matchup. But I do just want to point out that him wanting to fight in Vegas is not some crazy thing. I'm pretty sure at this point he's training out of Vegas. So if the options are, that venue compared to him fighting a month earlier, I think the UFC 312 card is in Australia. Like, it makes sense for him to want to fight closer to home. I, don't think anyone would really disagree with that. And when we look at Ramadan, it goes from March 28th. And when we look at Ramadan, it goes from February 28th through March 29th, which might just straight up rule out Umar. Now, maybe he says, I'm willing to have the last, week plus of my training camp at the beginning of Ramadan, but for a title shot, you're undefeated, seems like the UFC is kind of in your corner. I don't know if you want to go into your first title shot undefeated, kind of in bad circumstances, not fully fueled. So I do think that could be a spot where if Merab wants that Yan fight, the UFC can't force him to fight earlier if he doesn't want to. I don't think it would be crazy to see Merab versus Yan 2, and then with Umar kind of waiting for the winner. And if I did have to make a bet on what I thought was going to happen, I do think we're going to get that Merab-Yan second fight, the rematch, and then I'm guessing the winner of that fight will face Umar. I don't think they're going to make Umar fight again, especially if he's going to be postponed, from training, having a fight booked, getting into a training camp. With Ramadan, I think they do want Umar to fight for the belt. He obviously has the connection, the Nurmagomedov last name, and I would expect him to face the winner of Merab and Petr Yan. Now let's look at some of the other top contenders here and match them up. I want to start off with the Sean O'Malley Corey Sandhagen fight. I know there are going to be a lot of names thrown out there for Sean O'Malley. He obviously seems like the money fight here for these 135ers. I know some people really want to see the Petr Yan Sean O'Malley rematch. I'm not going to pretend like that wouldn't be a super fun fight. I would watch them fight every single weekend. But I do prefer this O'Malley-Sandhagen fight. It seems like it's been talked about for a while now. Two of the best strikers in the division. Just such a fun, stylistic matchup. Both guys who are still kind of close to that title picture. This is the fight I want to see. Would I be upset if we saw the O'Malley-Yan rematch? Certainly not. I mean, there are going to be a ton of names out there for O'Malley, but this is the one I would pick. I guess it just comes down to Sean O'Malley's timetable. He's talked about how he potentially wants to take a full year off. I don't know if Corey Sandhagen wants to wait around, but in my perfect world here, those two would be fighting. Now, so far, we have covered the top 4 ranked contenders here with Umar, Yan, Sean O'Malley, and then Corey Sandhagen. So now let's take a look at number 5 and number 6, which is Davison Figueiredo and Chito Vera. These guys have already faced off fairly recently. Figgy got the decision win. I really don't think Figgy loses much stock with his loss to Petr Yan. It was a fun fight. Everyone knows that Petr Yan is a super tough opponent. I want to see Figgy's next fight be against Jose Aldo. Now, if we're looking at the rankings, maybe this fight doesn't make a ton of sense because Figgy, is ranked much higher. Aldo's coming off a loss. Why is he able to, fight so far up off an L? Personally, I thought he won that fight. He's already taken like back-to-back matchups against kind of like young, up-and-coming bantamweights. He's still a huge name in this weight class, and I just think stylistically, it is a super fun matchup. Like, you cannot tell me you would not watch Deiveson Figueiredo go up against Jose Aldo. You know, two legends, Figgy a legend down at 135, Aldo just, an all-time great in MMA. I will say, if Dominic Cruz still wants to fight, I would also love to see the Cruz-Aldo matchup finally. So maybe that's the one fight that would kind of take precedence for me over the Figgy matchup, but we just don't know what's going on here with Dom Cruz in terms of his fighting future. And then the other guy who I mentioned who's in the top 6, Chito Vera. I think a matchup against Henry Cejudo makes some sense for both these guys. This fight was actually booked back in 2023. It would be fun to see it happen. Solid scrap between two of the more well-known guys in the division. For Henry Cejudo here, it seems like he does want a little bit of a step back in competition. Not sure what his ultimate goals are at this point. Like, is he still going for a title shot? If he's going to continue fighting, though, I think Cheeto's a little bit of a step down, from the guys he's faced in Aljo, who was holding the belt, and then Merab, who is now holding the belt. And then for Chito, I think stylistically, it is kind of an interesting matchup. We've seen him struggle a little bit going up against guys who can control him on the ground, even though he won the Frankie Edgar fight. A little bit of a concern there. The Sandhagen matchup, Sandhagen was able to rack up a ton of control time on him. Henry Cejudo is going to try to wrestle him. We'll see how Chito can deal with that in that potential fight. And then continuing going down the rankings here, number 8 and number 9 are Song Yadong and Rob Font. And I'm not just, ranking them together because they're ranked back-to-back. I actually think the fight does make a lot of sense here. You have Song Yadong, who is coming off a pretty competitive loss to Petr Yan. I think he, showed a good form in that fight. And then you have Rob Font, who is coming off a win where he was fighting down in the rankings against Kyler Phillips. I think Song Yadong, a little bit of a step back in competition. Rob Font coming off a win. I do think he deserves to kind of fight up in the rankings. So even though they're ranked back-to-back, I do think that fight makes a lot of sense here. And then the rest of the top 15 are all fairly fresh in the rankings. Guys who aren't super established at this point. We have Mario Bautista, Kyler Phillips, Amin Zahabi, Marcus McGee, and Montel Jackson. Definitely some fun fighters in here. Guys who could definitely make a run at the top 10, moving forward. I think out of those 5 fighters, if we're matchmaking these guys, within the top 15, one of them is going to have to fight outside the rankings. I think that should be Kyler Phillips here. He's the only guy out of these 5 who is coming off a loss. And I have 3 potential names of bantamweights who, could be deserving of a shot to get into the rankings. The 3 names I have are Said Nurmagomedov, Vinicius Oliveira, also known as Loke Dog, and then Peyton Talbot, if he does get through Raoni Barcelos in January, which I think most, including myself, do expect him to get through that fight. For Said Nurmagomedov, he has not fought in a year, which maybe they don't want someone who's, been inactive, kind of pulling out of fights to get that shot. But I think talent-wise, I do think he is top 15 caliber. We have Vinicius Oliveira, who is 2-0 in the UFC, has a KO of the Year contender in 2024, and then also a pretty clear win over Ricky Simone, who is someone who has been towards the bottom of that top 15 at bantamweight. So a super impressive, flashy first win, and then, a second win in the organization against a pretty established guy. For Peyton Talbot, I think it really would just come down to how quickly the UFC want to push him. If they want to get him right into the rankings, I actually think stylistically, Peyton Talbot versus Kyler Phillips is an insane fight, especially if it stays on the feet. I think that would just be a super fun matchup. And I don't think that's feeding Peyton Talbot to the wolves. I think it is a pretty competitive matchup between those two. So if Peyton Talbot does get through Raoni Barcelos, that would be my pick. I do think if you can kind of get him into the rankings, I think it's a reasonable step up in competition, especially if he looks good. I do think he'll kind of deserve that shot. Obviously, he's going to have a ton of push behind him based on the fan base he already has and, just being a super entertaining fighter. So that's my pick for Kyler Phillips going up against Peyton Talbot. And then we have the last 4 here. So we have Mario Bautista, Amin Zahabi, Marcus McGee, and Montel Jackson. I think you could pretty much matchmake any combination of these 4, with the exception of Mario Bautista and Marcus McGee, who I do believe train at the same gym. So doesn't really make any sense to book them together, especially back end of the top 15. If this was a number 1 contender fight or for the title, then sure, you can make that fight, but just doesn't seem to make a ton of sense at this point. So my picks would be Mario Bautista taking on Montel Jackson. Maybe that's a little bit mean because I do think Montel Jackson's super dangerous in this weight class. huge frame, has a ton of power. There's not a ton of fanfare behind Mario Bautista at this point. The way he beat Jose Aldo, maybe the way he kind of acted after it, not going to endear himself to a ton of fans. So I think that Jackson fight is interesting. I don't think he's going to get, a huge fight up in the ranks. I just, don't really see the incentive for the UFC to kind of push him in that way. And then the other matchup would be Aiemann Zahabi versus Marcus McGee. Fun striking match. Aiemann Zahabi broke into the rankings with a pretty clear win over Pedro Munoz. Marcus McGee just broke in with a win over Jonathan Martinez. Had a rough third round, but looked good in the first two. Super fun fighter, a finisher. So I think wins with those two matchups would set them up for fights within the top 10, to some of the losers of the earlier matchups that I talked about. But that's pretty much going to wrap it up. Matchmaking every single bantamweight here within the top 15. It's a fun weight class. In my opinion, at worst, it is the second best weight class in the UFC. And like I said, with no current top 15 guys ranked, everything is wide open. There are tons of fun fighters, fun fights that can be made. So let me know your thoughts on these matchups. Like I said at the top, if you have some other opinions, would love to hear them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.